When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's pick away at a medieval weapon designed to fight armor: the war pick. The history of the war pick is interesting to look at, and takes us all the way back to the ancient period. Behold, the humble pickaxe. A tool traced back to prehistoric times, the pickaxe was largely used in agriculture and mining, with its pointed end being very effective at breaking apart wood and stone. Before standing armies were a thing, most armed forces were made up of conscripts, so when laborers were pressed into military service, they would bring their tools with them: hand axes, scythes, daggers, and pickaxes. At some point, someone figured out that a tool that did a great job at splitting stone functioned just as well against bone and later armor, but the puncturing power of the pickaxe never really caught on. Maybe it was just unwieldy, or perhaps other weapons such as the spear, sword, or axe were just as effective against lightly armored opponents. Whatever the reason may have been, spiked puncturing weapons weren't widely adopted in the ancient period. Zooming forward to the 14th century, the emergence of plate armor prompted the development of a weapon to overcome it, resulting in the warhammers of mainland Europe. While I'll be covering warhammers and their effectiveness against armor in next week's video, their design caused a lot of weight to be focused on one side of the weapon. On one end, you have the main striking force where the hammerhead was, but you'd need weight on the opposite end to balance it out. At the same time, some clever designer realized that by focusing all the power of a strike into a single small point, a person could deliver a huge amount of force, enough to dent or even penetrate mail or plate armor. So, somewhere along the lines, someone looked at these two anti-armor weapon designs and thought, ¿Por qué no los dos? Thus, warhammers began featuring a spike on the opposite end of the head. The blunt side of the warhammer would be used to immobilize an enemy with concussive strikes, and once they're knocked down, the user would switch to the spike to try and punch through their armor and finish them off. This general ideology extended to many weapons of the time, and the additional spike was quite common throughout the Middle Ages. These weapons first became popular among infantry, but their effectiveness led them to be later adopted by cavalry around the 15th century. One such example was the horseman's pick, known in Polish as nożak. Despite having pick in its name, this warhammer was used by cavalry in Europe and parts of the Middle East to penetrate heavier armor, and was one of the main weapons of the Polish winged hussars. But wait, this video is supposed to be on the war pick, not the warhammer. What gives? Well, the war pick never saw wide adoption as a standalone weapon in the Middle Ages, at least as far as we know today. Warhammers already combined the best parts of both weapons, with a blunt hammerhead to concuss an enemy wearing plate mail, and a spike to puncture through the armor. Later polearms like the Lucerne hammer and bec de Corbin combined the anti-armor effectiveness of a warhammer with the reach of a spear, further making niche weapons like a war pick less necessary. I mean, think about it. If you had the choice between a weapon that was good at one thing, or a weapon that was good at 2 or 3 things, more often than not, you'd pick the more versatile weapon so that you'd be prepared against a variety of threats. On top of that, penetrating weapons like the pick had their own drawbacks that made them less versatile on their own. The smaller puncture of a spike required good aim to be immediately fatal, which is difficult to pull off when your target is actively fighting back. Plus, if your strike lands at a weird angle, which can happen if your target is moving or blocking, the force behind the strike would be diminished, further reducing the weapon's effectiveness. The extra momentum of being on horseback helped with these negatives, but the drawbacks were still there, and when put next to other weapons like axes, swords, or combination weapons like poleaxes or warhammers, it's easy to see how war picks didn't really hit the mainstream. All in all, the history of the war pick is shaky at best. There's a lot of overlap between the war pick and the warhammer, and while there may be examples out there of weapons that focus more on the spike than the hammerhead, they still fall into the same general category of niche, anti-armor melee weapons. After firearms entered the fray, the war pick largely disappeared from the battlefield, but this hasn't stopped the weapon from being implemented into various fantasy games and media. Today, the war pick remains a pivotal puncturing weapon in games like Dark Souls and Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, the war pick is described as a type of pickaxe designed for warfare. Designed to pierce through heavy armor types, they required training to wield effectively. Thus, they're considered martial weapons. Introduced in 1st edition, prior versions of the war pick cost between 5 and 20 gold pieces, weighed between 1.4 and 3.6 kilograms, and dealt either 1d4, 2d4, 1d6, or 1d8 piercing damage, depending on the variant and edition. In 5th edition, the war pick costs 5 gold pieces, weighs 0.9 kilograms, and deals 1d8 piercing damage. That's all the war pick has working for it as a weapon option. It deals moderate damage at a relatively low cost and weight, and that's really it. When compared to other 1d8 piercing weapons, its low cost and light weight help it stand out a bit. But if that's the only thing propping the weapon up, I don't think that's enough to call it good. It's better than the Morning Star, sure, but that's not saying much. All in all, the war pick is just kind of meh. It'll work well enough, I suppose, as 1d8 piercing damage puts it on par with weapons like the rapier. But unless you pair it with some fun features like Piercer, there's just no mechanical identity or role for the war pick to fulfill. So, the war pick works as a weapon option, but it feels a bit bland at the moment. It'll function well enough if a character chooses to use it, but players who want to use the war pick specifically will find no mechanical reason to use it over other martial melee weapons. So, rather than let the war pick sit in obscurity, I'd like to see what unique features or properties we can add to it that make players want to pick the pick. My first suggestion is to give the war pick the versatile weapon property. The versatile property allows characters to wield a weapon in 1 or 2 hands, adding more damage to their strikes at the cost of an offhand weapon or shield. Historically, this works for the war pick, since they could be shorter or longer depending on whether they were made for infantry or cavalry. But even in the context of D&D, it gives players more of a choice in how they wield this weapon. It seems that someone at Wizards of the Coast agrees with me, because this suggestion appears to have already been implemented in the 1D&D Unearthed Arcana. Now, I did suggest adding the versatile property to the Morning Star as well, but 1D&D is doing this in tandem with their Flex Weapon Mastery, which allows characters with Weapon Mastery to always deal the better versatile damage, even if the weapon is held in one hand. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out once we get our hands on the new sourcebooks this September. My second suggestion on how to fix the war pick in D&D is to allow it to maim creatures. Baldur's Gate 3 included additional weapon actions that were tied to each weapon, which could be used if your character was proficient with that weapon. For the war pick, they added Maiming Strike, which reduced a creature's movement speed to 0 and imposed disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. With this action added to the weapon, martial characters can not only have more control over enemy movement, but can use that disadvantage on dexterity saves to set them up for a well-placed fireball. Now, if this action was unlimited, it would definitely be overpowered, but Baldur's Gate 3 only allows these weapon actions once per short or long rest, so a similar once per rest system may work for tabletop as well. My third and final suggestion on how to fix the war pick is to grant it a bonus against heavy armor. Historically, spiked warhammers and war picks were anti-armor weapons, designed as a direct response to the rise of plate armor in the Middle Ages. However, the armor system in 5th edition is significantly watered down, and there's not a lot of ways for characters to tailor their weapons or fighting styles against different levels of armor, limiting the depth of gameplay options. If we wanted to add an anti-armor option to the war pick, we can include a weapon property called Sunder that states, when this weapon hits an enemy wearing medium or heavy armor, their armor class is lowered by 2 until the start of your next turn. A property like this would not only emphasize the warpick's anti-armor role, but would allow characters to lower an enemy's armor class temporarily, making it easier for follow-up attacks by them or their allies to hit the target. Now, I do understand that this might add a bit too much complexity to the game, as it would require constant tracking of armor types, snap ruling on natural armor, which many monsters have in lieu of wearing real armor, and just generally slow down the game. So a simpler version of this could just be allowing this property to affect any enemy, regardless of armor type, once per turn. All that being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to fix the war pick in D&D. As D&D players, we should want our choices, even simple ones like the weapons we use, to feel like they actually matter in the game. If we left the war pick alone, I'd have a hard time seeing why anyone would want to use it. But if we implemented some or all of the suggestions I put forward, the war pick can evolve into a dedicated anti-armor weapon that makes enemies more vulnerable to follow-up attacks. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the war pick. A niche weapon on its own, the war pick lacks a real identity with its current implementation in D&D. As little more than a cheaper and lighter Morningstar, the war pick doesn't have much else going for it. But by making a few changes, we can transform it into a debilitating weapon that allows its users to weaken enemies before delivering the killing blow. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the war pick? Do you think it's fine as it is? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to fix the war pick in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or a recurring donation, and to make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.